Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to be finding local and network vulnerabilities with Nessus. Alright, so let's get started. Now we've already installed and configured Nessus and we can start or get ready to start finding vulnerabilities. As I said, we're going to be looking at local vulnerabilities, so that are essentially vulnerabilities that are exist in the host operating system, in this case Kali Linux. And then finally we'll be looking at network vulnerabilities, where we'll be targeting our Metasploitable 2 virtual machine. So that is going to be a prerequisite. You can use another Windows virtual machine if that's what you're trying to do, or you can also target a Mac operating system. But irregardless of that, we're going to be using Metasploitable 2 so that I can demonstrate how one would go about finding vulnerabilities on your local system, and then furthermore on the network when targeting a host. Alright, so as I said, we're doing this on our virtual lab that we created, so the environment is going to be perfect. So let's get started. Now, again, just open up Nessus, and my session has expired. So to access Nessus, as you saw, we use HTTPS 127.0.0.1 port 8834. Alright, and you want to just enter your username and the password that we created. So I'm going to do that right now. And excellent, there we are. So it has taken us into Nessus. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what do we do now? Well, the first thing we need to do is understand the interface. Alright, so the Nessus interface is really simple to understand. So it is sorted out into three sections here. You have your settings, your scans, and obviously on the left hand side, this is your toolbar that contains all the frequently used menus and options that you can use. Alright, so in the settings, I'm just going to breeze over the settings because that is really up to you whether you want to configure it. So in terms of the about, here you would find an overview of your Nessus home version or your professional version that you're running. It will give you about the information about the version that you're running, or what operating system you're running it on, when it was last updated, the expiration date, and what is your activation code. You can check for software updates and update it here, and also set the update frequency. Alright, when it comes down to master passwords, you can set your master password here if you want to. Alright, moving on to advanced settings. This is this is pretty self-explanatory. These are all settings that will help you fine-tune your scanning. I'm not going to go over this because this is more of an advanced feature. Alright, when you go on to proxy servers, you have the ability to use proxy servers, SMTP servers, and you have your custom certificates that you can also use. Alright. When it comes down to my account, you can configure settings about your account here, and you can check for your API keys. You can also change your password if you want to, and add your email. Alright, so this is just more to do with customization of your user profile. You can also go to users and you can configure the users that already exist and check their role or add new users. Alright, so it's really great that you can do that. Now going back to scans. Alright, so in here, as you can see, it's going to tell you that the folder is empty, create a new scan. That's because we haven't actually started scanning our target, right? So if we move to the left here, we have folders. So we have my scans, all scans, and trash. Alright, the trash is where you essentially get rid of the scans that you're done with, or scans that are irrelevant to you. As for the resources, this is going to be very important. We're going to be looking at policies, which are essentially templates that you can create for scans. Which we'll be looking at in a few seconds. You then have your plugin rules and your scanners. Alright, so let's get started now with scanning for local vulnerabilities on Kali Linux, which is our host operating system. So to do that, the first thing we need to do is look for a local IP address for Kali Linux, and you can do this by just entering the command ifconfig, and you want to look for the inet address that is right here. So the inet address in this case is 192.168.1.106. So just keep that in mind. Alright, so once we have that, you want to go into policies, and policies, as you can see here, once you click on it, the menu, and it gives you some information here. So policies allow you to create custom templates defining what actions are performed during a scan. So they're essentially templates that deal with what actions are going to be performed during the scan. So options or scan options. Alright, so once they're created, they can be selected from a list of scan templates. We'll also be looking at that very shortly. Alright, so what we want to do is you can import a policy if you've been using Nessus before and you have saved a policy. But in this case, we haven't used Nessus before. So we're going to hit create new policy, and now it's going to take you to the policy templates. Now, as you can see, the policy templates, there are quite a few, and they're divided into the home and the professional version, where in order for you to use some of these other more advanced templates, actually you have the professional version. But regardless of that, it gives you the most essential ones, which are the advanced scan, the shell shock detection, padlock detection, which if you have heard of, these are very, very common vulnerabilities. If you're aware of them in the cybersecurity world or in the malware world. You then have your basic network scan, very, very important. We have the credential patch audit, host discovery, which is essentially going to scan for live hosts and the open ports on those hosts. You have the malware scan, which is going to scan for malware on Windows and Unix systems. Great. This is fantastic. This is a great feature for system administrators and also network administrators. All right. You can also scan for the shadow brokers, leaks, all the vulnerabilities that exist within the shadow broker leaks. You have the Spectre and Meltdown checker, one of my favorite new additions. It essentially checks for the latest vulnerabilities and CVEs regarding the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities or flaws in the processes. So that's also something very, very interesting that you can check out for yourself. You also have your WannaCry ransomware check. You have your web application check, where it'll essentially check for the web applications. If you specify a host that is running on a web server, it'll check for any of the vulnerabilities when it comes down to the templates. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to perform an advanced scan on the local host, which is Kali Linux. All right, so to do that, we click on the advanced scan, and now it's going to ask you here to give a name to the scan. So I'm just going to call it Kali Linux, or I'm just going to call it advanced scan, all right, or local scan. That's much better because it defines what we're doing. And furthermore, when we'll be creating our scan and giving it a name, it will be a much better way of naming it, or in terms of naming conventions. Now, in terms of the settings here, you can see that you have your permissions tab as well. Now, permissions is very, very simple to understand. This is essentially the permissions you want to give the users, or whether or not they can access this plugin. So because we want all users on Nessus to be able to access this plugin, we'll just leave it to the default as no access or can use. All right. So you can just leave that as the default, which is no access. All right. Because we are the systems administrator anyway. When we go to discovery, you want to make sure ping the remote host is left on, because it will essentially ping to test whether the host is online. All right. Now, when it comes down to the ping methods, make sure the ARP, the address resolution protocol, pardon my language there, and we have the transmission control protocol, the ICMP. Make sure that these three are currently ticked, because these are the most important ones, the important ping tests. When it comes down to port scanning, just leave this as default. We don't need to change anything here. Again, these are more advanced, so we are not going to be looking at that right now. When it comes down to service discovery, just make sure you probe all ports to find services. This is going to, it's essentially going to perform scans on all the ports and find the services, and then match them against common vulnerabilities that are currently, very, very popular on those services that are running on those ports. Okay, when it comes down to assessment, you can just leave that as it is. These are not things that we want to touch right now. When it comes down to report, again, leave that as it is. And advanced, you can just leave that as it is as well. So we just want to touch the basic, which we have looked at, and the general settings, where we gave the policy template a name, and you can also give it a description. When it comes down to credentials, here is where you can enter the default credentials that you want to test for vulnerabilities against. For example, you can give the default credentials for SSH, and it will test the vulnerabilities against the SSH port. When it comes down to the compliance, you don't have to touch. This is an advanced section here, so I would recommend that you do not play with this. When it comes down to plugins, this is the most important. So the plugins essentially are vulnerabilities that you can use, plugin vulnerabilities that allow you to scan for specific vulnerabilities. So for example, you can scan for brute force attacks, which are currently enabled. If you look at the structure of the menu, on the left side, you have the plugins that are enabled, and on the right side, it gives you information about the plugins. All right. So as you can see, you can show the enabled, and as you can see, we have done that. So you can hit show all, and you can show the enabled ones. So currently all of the plugins are enabled, but we do not want to leave this as the default, because we want to scan for a few vulnerabilities that are very, very common. We're just going to scan for basic ones that are very, very common against a Linux subsystem or Linux operating system for this matter. All right. So more specifically, the ones that we're going to, the ones that we're actually going to use, let me just show all there. So I'm going to disable all of these ones. The only ones I'm going to leave open are the default Unix accounts, this one right here. So this is just, if you click on it, it's essentially just going to test the default usernames for the Linux distribution against the default passwords. So that's what the plugin is going to do. I'm going to disable all these other ones right here. Hopefully I can get them disabled. There we are. Don't worry if it's a little bit slow. It usually has that issue. And I'm just going to disable all of these other ones. We'll be looking at some of these plugins more advanced when we'll be looking at performing a scan against Metasploitable 2. All right. So we're just going to disable all of these ones here. And the one we want to look for is the Ubuntu local security check, because it's going to check against Debian security checks. So there it is. Let me just enable it. Ubuntu local security checks. If you click on it, just give it a few seconds if it takes some time. And let me just disable these other ones. Of course, it's going to be a bit slow, but don't worry about that at all. All right. So once you've selected Ubuntu security checks and the default Unix accounts, it is essentially, those are all the plugins that we want to select. Once that is done, just hit save. All right. So again, you can run this on your local operating system, which in many cases, it could be Windows if you're using Nessus on Windows, or in this case, we're running it on Kali Linux. And these are some basic plugins that you can use. So I'm just going to hit save. And this scan will reveal some very, very basic information, not really any vulnerabilities, because I haven't used any specific plugins. But this, the first example where I'm showing you how to scan for local vulnerabilities, this is just going to be a simple scan. When we move over to Metasploitable 2, that is going to be when we moved into an advanced section. All right, so we have created the policy, and as you can see, it's going to be stored under policies. So this is a template that you can use at any time. So now we need to perform the scan, and you might be asking yourself, well, how do we do this? Well, we go into the My Scans folder, and you want to hit create a new scan. All right, so once you do that, it's going to take you to the scan templates. Now, because we already created our policy, which is essentially a template, we can select on the user defined menu and we'll find our policy there. Excellent. So it's called local scan. So we're going to click on it. And now we need to give a name to the scan. All right. Not the policy, a name for the scan. In this case, the name is going to be Kali Linux scan. All right. So we're not expecting a lot of vulnerabilities to find a lot of vulnerabilities here, but it'll be interesting to see what we get nonetheless. Now, you can add a description and you can just leave the folder to the default My Scans folder. When it comes down to targets, here is where you would specify the targets, your target IP or your target range, your target network range, your target domain, all of that good stuff. So in this case, we're going to be targeting the IP address, which is, as we saw, 192.168.1.106. You can just copy that to save time if you have run the command. And all you'd have to do is just paste it in. All right. Now, mind you, you can also add a range. So if you wanted to add the range of 106 to 110, we could also do that. If you wanted to add a subnet, so we could add the entire subnet, network subnet, and it'll scan for all the targets on the network. But as we know, that's going to take quite a while. So we'll just change it to the default IP address for Kali Linux, which in this case is 192.168.1.106. All right. So once you're done, just hit save. And it's going to save it to your scans, and to get it running or to start the scan, just move here to the right and hit launch. All right. You can also stop the scan from here. And the way to know if the scan is currently running, it's going to display these green arrows here, this progress bar that is essentially telling you that the scan is running. Once it's done, it'll tell you it's done, and you can click on the scan and it'll show you the results. So this will take some time depending on the plugins you've selected and the whether or not you've chosen many multiple targets or you've chosen the entire subnet. But in this case, it shouldn't take too much time because we've selected a singular target. So I'll get back to you when the scan is complete. Alright, so the scan is complete, and that will be denoted by a little tick icon there, and that means that the scan is complete. So in order to analyze the results that we've got from the scan, just click on the scan or double click on it, and it should give you this little menu here that shows you or sorts the information really well. So as I said, this is going to be a very basic scan. As you can see, the results are very basic, but don't worry, this was just to get you up to scratch with how to use Nessus. Alright, so let's look at how to go through the results. So as you can see, it's sorted into three options. You have your hosts, vulnerabilities, and your history. So in terms of hosts, it did recognize that 192.168.1.106 was a host. And in terms of vulnerabilities, it gives you this little bar here with the color blue, which I'll get to in a second, and it gives you 2. So that means it was able to get 2 vulnerabilities. Alright, but now if we go to the right here, we can see that the scan details This is essentially information about the scan. So it's going to give you information like the name of the scan, the status, the policy you are using, the start time, the end time, and the elapsed time that the scan took. Alright, now when it comes down to vulnerabilities, this is my favorite part. It sorts out the vulnerabilities in a pie chart, alright? And essentially it is sorted into color. So as you can see, if you use the key here, you have blue as info, green as low, yellow as medium, orange as high, and red as critical. So in this case, we're only able to gather information about vulnerabilities that exist. Alright, and that can be accessed in the vulnerabilities tab. So if I click on that, it's going to just show you one vulnerability here that we currently have, and that is the netstat port scanner. It is essentially a vulnerability that allows Nessus to run a netstat command. So netstat is a very, very good networking tool. If you have heard of it, it is known as the Swiss Army knife of network tools. It's great for connecting one computer to another. So netstat was able to run the scan on the remote host and enumerate the open ports. So essentially what it's saying here is it was able to enumerate open ports. Nothing, seriously important here. In the next video, when we'll be moving on to finding vulnerabilities in Linux and Windows systems, this is where we'll look at some really, really huge vulnerabilities and how they're sorted out. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. In this video, we looked at how to find vulnerabilities, local vulnerabilities on our network. And yeah, that's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we'll be looking at finding local vulnerabilities on Linux and Windows. Right, so I'll be seeing you in the next video.